Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and I'm here with Dominic Crossan. And today, as part of our Lenten class, we're going to be looking at Paul and Luke and their relationship. And if you have not watched the lecture that this is based on, then and you're in the class, go to the resource page. If you're not, go to crossanclass.com, join up. There's 5 different lectures. You can enjoy them and then send in questions, like a whole bunch of them that we got. And I've hopefully successfully put them all in under 240 characters, Dom, and
Yes.
organized them in the structure of your lecture. So we're gonna have a bunch of fun. But how are you doing? And is there a particular way you want to kind of like frame the conversation, knowing all the different questions people submitted?
Well, the first thing, as you can see, is I have a green halo. That's because of St. Patrick's Day. So everyone should have a green halo for St. Patrick's Day, at least some kind of a glow. All right. Could you, for a moment, put up the background that is behind me, the virtual background, without me in the way, and as big as you can? This is, with great gratitude to Sarah, an image taken in northeastern Romanian, Probota Monastery. In the narthex, they have images of the 7 ecumenical councils, and pride of place goes, of course, to Nicaea in 325. I want you to look at that and keep it in mind throughout today. Just a couple of words about it. It's the most honest portrayal of what we might call religious imperialism or religious nationalism that you've ever see. Down at the floor is good old Arius. He's been dumped on the floor. Up on the left, you can see Athanasius taking the good news up to Jesus, who is very, 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 very small. Do you see him there in the middle, above the spears, or among the spears of the emperor? Constantine, of course, is in the middle on a high throne, and around him are his courtiers, and around the courtiers are the legions. It's all quite clear who is in charge. And of course, he has a halo. Now look at the proceedings, shall we say, of Nicaea. It comes from the bishops on the left of your screen, takes a huge arch up over his lap for approval, as it were, then goes all the way to the scribe on the right. And as I said, you can barely see Jesus up at the top. So the problem is, what do you do when the emperor joins you? What do you do when the emperor is also divine, and you have Jesus divine and the emperor divine, and you'd like to get home from Nicaea without being crucified? So please understand the problems of when the emperor joins you. When the emperor is smart enough, then or now, to figure out you do not oppose religion, you co-opt it. People will always sell their faith for finances. At least some will. So keep that in mind when we get into the questions. All right. Shut up and go to the questions.
All righty. So the first question comes from Greg. How does understanding Paul's relationship with Luke crucial for interpreting early Christian text?
All right. I have about 15 questions that were sent to me, so it's about 4 minutes apiece. A lot of them are the same, so I'll try and focus each one. Okay. The important thing is Christian text, before and after. Before Luke, I'm saying before, you could argue whether the pastorals come around the same time as Luke, but in terms of opposition to Paul, negation of Paul, I'm going to put them first, because after all, they do admit he's an apostle. They simply take what he says about women and men, or husbands and wives, or slaves and masters and mistresses, and kind of dilute them. You know that already. Actually, Luke asks us something far more. It simply denies he's apostle, and we'd have to see much more of that today. Well, if he's not an apostle, he really don't have to care what he says, at least in the first rank. And then later texts are all of those images we saw of the reconciliation, the hugging, as it were, of Peter and Paul. So it spans a huge amount. It's not just about Luke Acts. It's about a whole process of putting Peter above Paul, and then reconciling them as Peter hugging Paul.
Hmm. Yeah. And one of the questions that is connected here comes from Martha, who asks, "How does recognizing Luke Acts as a unified work change our understanding of Luke's portrayal of Paul? What is Luke's theological commitment that inspired his narrative?"
Thank you, Martha. I think if I just had Acts as a separate book and none of that stuff, and I read it, I think I would get what he's doing quite clearly. I really would. Now, I might be not so secure about the overall theological why he's doing it. But when I read it as a unified thing, I see a process going on. For example, I Luke opens after the overture, the childhood. He opens up with the first great day. Now he's using Mark, so you can read a source. Mark says Jesus had a marvelous day at Capernaum. Oh, it was marvelous. Luke turns it into a lethal day at Nazareth. Now, why does he do that? I've got his source, so I see him changing it. So he's already setting up a pattern of violent, murderous Jews right from Nazareth. Don't believe a word of it, by the way. So when I look at the whole sweep of the two volumes, that's when I begin to say, okay, I think I know what Luke Acts is up to, and Paul is simply, how should I put it, a major character. I don't want to say the major character, because for Luke Acts, the Holy Spirit is always the major character, but he is at least a main character of the second volume. So it is because of the duality and the whole process that I'm more secure on what Luke is up to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's helpful. One of the themes that you kind of raised throughout the lecture is the larger agenda of Luke, and the narrative move from Jerusalem to Rome. And there were a couple of questions about it. Jenny's, I thought, did a great job of capturing it in a succinct way, where she asked, "In what ways does Luke's version of Rome as the new holy city represent a significant departure from Paul's own theology? Does Luke have other allies in the early church that are making this kind of geographical transition?"
Oh yeah, Paul would be screaming, because Paul hoped that even though he could see his own people were not all clamoring to become messianic Christics, as I call them, he still had hopes, I think, until he died, that somehow, maybe at the last minute, how would I put it, maybe even jealousy about the Gentiles would bring his own people in. To the very end, he imagined a single covenant. And his analogy with the olive tree says that. I think what Paul never imagined, and what he should have imagined maybe, is that you could have an olive tree with two trunks coming out of the same ground, not a big olive tree with a small little one or anything like that, but a double olive tree. He never got to imagine that because he died too soon. So basically, this idea of Rome as the new holy city, he would be screaming. He would be screaming.
And so across the in the other parts of the New Testament, this obviously focusing on Luke Acts, do you see, say, in the pastorals or some of the Deutero-Pauline letters, or in Peter or Revelation and these other places, do you see a similar kind of move to centering Rome?
Leave Revelation aside for a moment. Of course, yes, the whole process of muting the anti-Romanization. Now, I'm not going to say, well, the message is clear about Christ is still the Son of God. They're just giving up a little bit on the social implications. That's rubbish. This idea of the social implications, or what the Germans call the Kerygma, is good, but the Didache can be negotiated. No, it's a package. If you are, Paul would say, in Christ, this is how you operate. If you do not operate like this, then you're probably not really in Christ. So it's very much a package deal. And, and that's the problem. It's the package deal. Otherwise, it's all theory up in heaven. And as we saw in that image that's behind me, Constantine would have said, well, Jesus is in heaven with the angels. I am on earth with the legions. Your choice. That's the problem those poor bishops had, to try and tell, how could Jesus be a kind of a superior God to Constantine, who was already a god, when he had the legions, but Constantine had Jesus had the angels, and Constantine had the legions. And preferably, how could we negotiate all of this in this lovely summer palace at Lake Nicaea, which is a gorgeous lake, by the way, still, and get home without being crucified? How do we do this? So that's the problem when the empire joins you.
Well, luckily, Dom, we've evolved past it. Now
Oh, yeah.
religious people aren't tempted to forsake their commitment to their executed Lord for
No,
earthly power.
no. This is all the first century, maybe into the 4th century. After that, none of this at all has any application. That's why I'm talking about the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century, to be safe from the 21st century. Of course, that's where we see it. That's where we get the power and the strength to oppose it, that we're not alone and we're not starting off the opposition.
You at the beginning of that response, you suggested you wanted to bracket Revelation. Is there anything, when you think of the contrast of Paul in relationship to Rome, Luke, Acts, and what's going on in Revelation?
And thank you very much for reminding me, because when I get into it, I tend to forget the question very often. Yes, Revelation is exactly the opposite. That's why in the book, sorry if this is a commercial message, Render unto Caesar, I really began by looking at Luke, Acts, and Revelation. If somebody say, let me put it in the place, at Ephesus or Smyrna or somewhere like that, Izmir, said, I don't see, years 100, let's say, I don't see why I can't be a good Roman and a good Christian even. I don't see what's the problem. I just do my negotiation. I deal with my merchandise, and it goes around it, the Roman globalization. And what the book of Revelation does is, I'm going to paint you as absolutely obscene an image of Rome that you won't even imagine having anything to do with it. That's why chapter 18 is about business. The legions never come into the book of Revelation. It's business, because book of Revelation sees that as the nose of the camel already in there. If you work with Rome, I'm just talking about, globalization, Mediterranean globalization, they've got you already. So Revelation, the logic of Revelation is to paint you a picture so bad of Rome that you can't even mention the name. Now, Luke, Acts represents exactly the opposite. Yes, we can negotiate with Rome. Yes, they'll have to give, we'll have to give, of course. But yes, we should negotiate with Rome. Now, Paul is kind of caught in the middle. If people ask him, I'm in business with Rome, and my boss sometimes invites me on his birthday to come to the local temple, and we use one of the rental rooms. And sometimes they have meat there that might have been left over from sacrifice. And can I do it? And Paul's answer is, of course you can do it, because you know what you're doing. It's got nothing to do with, you don't accept it as sacrifice. Now, John of Patmos is tearing his hair, and Luke is probably saying, what's the problem? he probably doesn't even see it as a problem. So yes, it's wider, and it shows who's on whose side.
Yeah, that's helpful. One of the questions that Stan sent is really around the different visions of the Jerusalem Council, and maybe say a bit about the Jerusalem, what happened there and how it's functioned in church history, before answering his question about that contrast between Paul's account of what happened in Jerusalem in Galatians versus Luke's betrayal in Acts 15. What is that? How does that help you kind of like reveal what Luke's agenda is that you presented in the lecture?
Okay, so let me imagine the problems. And if they sound like dated problems to us, imagine what we find crucial today, say about hormonal marriages instead of organic marriages. Let me put it that way. Think of our problems today, maybe 2,000 years from now, might be wondering, what are they talking about? So the question is this. If let me use a simple term, if a pagan becomes a Christian, use that term, does he have first to become a Jew? Meaning, if he is male, he has to be circumcised. Then he becomes a Christian. So, is a Christian kind of like a super Jew, male, kind of circumcised? Of course, of course. That's the first question. And Paul says no. A Jew, excuse me, a pagan, using that terminology, can become a Christian mystic. A Christian mystic, I meant to say a messianic Christic, without being circumcised. Notice this doesn't apply to women at all. It doesn't even come up to women. It comes up only for males. So that's one issue. A second issue is this. Supposing we grant a certain distinction between Jewish messianic Christics who are kind of still following kosher, just because maybe that's the way they like to eat, and Gentile, pagan, messianic Christics, and they're in the same community, Antioch, let's say, and they're having a common meal, a Eucharist, which is a full meal. Do they observe kosher for all or kosher for none? Those are the two problems they're facing. And if we think of them as yawn, what's the issue? Pick any two you want today that are crucial in our world today and imagine them 2,000 years from now. Okay, those are the problems. Now, there's a meeting at Jerusalem. A council kind of is a fancy name for it. There's a meeting at least. And imagine you don't know anything about Paul at all, except you've read this account in Acts 15. After I'm finished today, go back and read it. What you're going to conclude, quite fairly from the text, is there's a guy called James, and he's really the boss. Oh, he's running the show. Everyone gets to talk. It's quite lovely. I mean, there's a full discussion. It's like a little miniature Roman Senate. And there's a guy called Peter. He's very much the next most important. He gets to speak, I mean, verbatim. He's quoted in the record, as it were. James is quoted. Peter is this guy. And Peter says, God chose me to bring in the Gentiles. Then there's these guys called Barnabas and Paul. Watch the order. And, well, they're there and they get to tell something, but they're not quoted. Nothing verbatim. They're just told what happened. At the end, James, the leader, is going to draw up a letter, a rescript. This is really like lovely. It's like a little miniature Roman Senate. Very peaceful. He draws up a rescript and he sends it out. Now, you think he'd send it out with Barnabas and Paul, but yeah, kind of, it goes with them. But there's these guys, Judas and Silas, who have to tell what happened. Why can't Barnabas and Paul tell what happened? So when you read through that, my conclusion would be, okay, James is very important. Peter is the next most important. Judas and Silas seem to be very important because their voice is going to be the witness. And yeah, there's these two guys, Barnabas and Paul. Well, they were there. That's what you get if you read it honestly and don't bring in Paul. It's a lovely scenario and would reassure the Romans, here's how we make our decisions. Aren't we peaceful? See how we work out our problems. Don't worry about us, dear Romans. We won't spill out into the streets and start a public fight. So it's a magnificent piece of apologetics if you haven't read Galatians, which Paul swears to as the truth, and I think it is the truth.
Yeah. And in Galatians, the contrast?
Well, first of all, the language that Paul uses is really, really profoundly dismissive. Mm-hmm. He calls the authorities the seeming somebodies. King James gets it much more accurately than New Revised, who doesn't want to say the seeming somebody. Hoi dakuntes, the seeming ones. They're not authorities. Paul, even though Paul says they agreed with me. So at the end, he won in plain language. At least he got what he wanted. Why did it use such crude language? Why call them the seeming somebodies about 3 different times? I think Paul was ambushed. I'm not sure at all he knew what he was coming for. I think he may well have been bringing alms from Antioch to Jerusalem, uh, and he was ambushed by this problem because he is not respectful towards the authorities, even though he admits they are there. I can't think he'd do that unless he figures they kind of ambushed him a bit, that they maybe were a bit too much on the side of the objections. So his account then is that concept language, the seeming ones. And then, of course, the second problem is at Antioch, and he calls Peter a hypocrite. And to be fair, I don't think Peter was a hypocrite. I think Peter would have said, if he got to reply, look, why you're such a hard head, Paul. This is just courtesy. There's no messianic Christic rule that says we Gentiles must eat shellfish. If I go to, Peter would have said, if I go among my fellow Jews and they're observing kosher, I will observe kosher. No, I don't think I am bound by God to do it any longer. I think Peter would agree with that, but I can still do it. What's the big deal, Paul? And in one sense, Paul agrees with that in Romans when he kind of says himself, what's the big deal? You just go along with it. You don't have to. You don't have to observe kosher anymore. But it won't kill you to do it just for peace in the community.
If we reimagined the conversation in Jerusalem, where Paul's reports in Galatians get put back in, what are the it is what we know about James and Peter and that community. Does Luke, Acts capture what their response was, or do you see the Luke, Acts narrative kind of creating this harmonious narrative for Luke, Acts question in relationship to Rome, and perhaps Peter, James, Paul would have had a different conversation altogether?
Okay, if I leave out the nasty language and just look at what happens, I think for sure, historically speaking, there was an agreement to split the mission. Now, be very careful. If you agree to split the mission, have you agreed to split the vision? That's the thing. In other words, is this the moment when the inevitable became inevitable? That these two groups were going in opposite ways? Because the agreement was that, I think, in fact, that James is going to be sort of the ideal church in Jerusalem. I think James is practicing something like Essene, common community. Leave him aside. Peter is going to be in charge of the mission to the Jews. Barnabas and Paul, still in this order probably, are going to be in charge of the mission to the Gentiles. Now, I think that's like saying today, the Roman Catholic Church will now allow women priests, but the male priest will take care of the men and the female priest will take care of the women. Now, could you imagine trying to administer something like that in a community where they're both there? So let's go up to Antioch. They're both there. If over in the West were all the Jewish Messianic Christics, and over in the East were but they're both in the same place, all over the place. How are you going to have Peter handing one group and Paul handing the other group without immediately what's going to happen? What about common meals? So it's a recipe for disaster. It's a recipe for a split, not just in the strategy of the mission, like as if you sent English-speaking people to the English and the Spanish-speaking people to the Spaniards. Okay, that sort of administration can be worked out. But I think this is doomed. And Paul's whole desperation, when we talk about the collection, is to try and attempt to see if a split in mission does not become a split in, what shall we say, looking back, religion even.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Josh in the chat just put up this follow-up question where he asked, What does Dom think about the idea that in Galatians 2, the issue isn't keeping kosher, but honoring the emperor, something Jews would have been exempt from, but the nations would be compelled to do?
I don't see it. I mean, that's a simple my answer, Josh. It could be, but I don't see it, because very clearly in Galatians it has to do with circumcision. So I just don't see it. That's my answer.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that in the larger story you talk about in the lecture is Luke's portrayal of the Jews as hostile instigators in Rome. Have this kind of they're giving a kind of gracious receptivity that's running through. And Anthony asked a question about it, about how this was important to the overall strategy, and I'm guessing the narrative strategy of Luke Acts.
Okay, Anthony, and remember what I said before. At the very beginning, we get to see Luke, using that as the author, using his source, Mark. And I ask you, why on earth would he turn a successful day at Capernaum, as you have in his source, Mark, into a murderous day at Nazareth, except that he's not writing about Jesus at all? I'm looking at Luke, writing Luke 4 and thinking of Paul. He's thinking of his second volume already. It's already structured in his mind. Jesus goes into the synagogue, everything on the Sabbath, as Paul will later, everything seems to be going so good. And then gratuitously, and for no reason, he suddenly brings up two Gentile stories and seems to be saying, see, God prefers the Gentile to you Jews. Then all heaven breaks loose, shall we say? And they try to kill him. And then in the very next verse, off goes Jesus back into other synagogues and everything's lovely. Luke 4 makes absolutely no sense except as the beginning and the great model for what's going to happen at Pisidian Antioch and Thessalonica. He's writing Paul back into Jesus. So I see it going on all the time. Now, remember that other big example, the exculpation of Jesus in Jerusalem, preparing for Paul in Jerusalem, because Jesus is exculpated by the three levels of Roman authority: the centurion beneath the cross who says innocent, changing mark once again; the Antipas who's brought down from Galilee, so a client ruler can say innocent; and then, of course, good old Pilate. 3 times he says it, in case you can't count. Luke says. You have exactly the same with the second volume. You should be waiting for it. What happens to Paul in Jerusalem? A tribune. Wow, not a centurion. A tribune writes a letter. Wow, saying he's innocent. Then Herod Agrippa II, a king, Herodian king, not a Herodian prince like Antipas, says he's innocent. Wow, Festus, innocent. This is a perfect storm of innocence across the 2 volumes. So again, the totality persuades me very much in a way that either volume, honestly, might not persuade me. It might make me suspicious, but not. So the double thing, the violence of the Jews, because any Roman would say, if a Roman ever bothered reading Luke Acts, which they wouldn't consider the Greek good enough, but if they did, and that's probably the best in the New Testament, by the way, if the Roman read it, he said, every time I hear about these Christian jerks, there's a riot and there's trouble. Oh, yes, dear Romans, says Luke, it's them Jews.
Yeah.
Now, remember, he's saying this after the Great Jewish War. He's playing right into Rome's anti-Semitism. This is dangerous time. It's not as if Luke was writing in the year 40. He's writing after Romans have seen coins with Judea capta, Judea crushed on it. And a lot of Romans, if they heard this, would be saying, yeah, we know about them guys. We know them. They're troublemakers. Look what they did. So this is terribly volatile, dangerous stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Danny sent a number of different questions, one of them around anti-Semitism. And And I know if this is a topic that's interesting to people, they can also find the lecture you gave looking at the Passion play and the narrative of it in the Passion Week. That's already available on YouTube. But here, Danny's asking how we should address the Luke Acts kind of anti-Semitic tendencies and shifting blame onto Jews for Paul's treatment. Is this similar to what happens in John's Gospel of, when it has the category of the Jews as a character?
Yes. And for the most succinctly accurate, historically accurate one, we have good old Josephus, who said the first men among us handed him over to Pilate. I think that's right. They were collaborating with Pilate, and this guy Jesus was dangerous. We don't have to demonize Caiaphas. He's a quisling. If you want to use that name, that's his job. And at his best, he would be kind of mediating Roman power to his own people at his best. At his worst, he's just taking care of himself. But in any case, that's where he is. Now, it's far wider than that across Luke Acts. If it was just the Passion, but we're back to Luke 4 all over again. So the anti-Judaism, I'm different about anti-Semitism because that's a racial term. This is anti-Judaism. Obviously, anti-Semitism, even conversion, is not adequate to save you from anti-Semitism. But anti-Judaism is there, and it's running all the way through Luke Acts. Yes, we have to face it. Now, I think the reason for it is, at least Luke, the author. You can do a good profile of the author of Luke Acts. Just call him Luke for the moment. He is, I think, a God worshiper, or a God-fearer, or a God lover. That's why he knows so much about Judaism and doesn't like it. But he knows it. I think the difference in John's gospel, I think John was a Samaritan. He's looking at the Jews from the point of view of the Samaritans. Now, again, in the long haul of history, these are very dangerous oppositions. But of course, if you're looking for it, then you can go into the Jewish Bible and read what the prophets or the psalmist said about their people when they're criticizing them. If you're looking for content to justify your prejudice, you'll find it. And especially among a people who are self-critical. And because only a people who are self-critical can survive. Let me be blunt once again. The reason why Judaism has survived its location on the Levantine coast is because they were intensely and accurately self-critical. Without self-criticism, people are doomed.
Yeah. Now we have a number of questions that are broadly related to how Paul understood his mission, and in contrast to how it's depicted in Luke Acts. And the first one, Mark asks, if Paul is primarily targeting God worshippers rather than pure pagans, how does this change our understanding of his missionary strategy and success? And you might just remind everyone what the God worshippers are in contrast to pagans.
All right. When Paul talks about, say, Jews and Greeks, or Jews and the nations, or Gentiles, what are we talking about? Is he imagining, as it were, going out into the agora and the forum, getting up in the soapbox and talking about Jesus, and people are listening? Or is he imagining this? We now know, and whether we like it or not, by the way, whether we like it from the Jewish point or the Christian point, I'm talking now in modern categories, there were large numbers, really large numbers of Gentiles, of the nations, who were faithful to the Jewish God. I think probably anyone who is thinking, and that's always a danger in a religion, that somebody may start thinking, and they may start saying, Zeus or Jupiter are really kind of like criminals. If you do what they do, you'll go straight to jail if you're not immediately liquidated. Every time Jupiter comes down, he's raping somebody. It's only a question under what guise. Who on earth believes about That's the supreme God. Now, over here, you have the Jewish God, and he seems to be a God of justice. At least you could model yourself on him, at least in theory. So I'm kind of interested. Now, okay, I'm not going to do anything crazy like get myself circumcised, because that there goes my whole future in the local Senate, the Bulletarian. But yeah, I'm interested. I'm interested. I like this Jewish God, and I like the type of community it creates. I like going to the synagogue on the Sabbath and being educated. And there's no smell of burning sacrifice, but my mind can be on fire, as it were. And yeah, I kind of like lots about their morality too, especially their family values. I kind of like that stuff. And yeah, by the way, yeah, I like the whole business web that they have across the Mediterranean. I'm interested in my olive oil, and yeah, but it's a whole package deal. I'm very sympathetic. And by the way, I'm a member of the city council, and I've no trouble going to the synagogue on the Sabbath, and I'll even put my name up when donation time comes around. I'm not ashamed. Now, that's the huge thing I think we have to accept when we look at the first century and the second century and the third century, that there were these males who wouldn't get circumcised, but would almost take everything else. And again, I repeat, we have no idea how to compute how many females, since they control the kitchen. And how could you tell? If I was a woman, if I were a woman and I wanted to run my house, as it were, I just did it. So we have to rethink what Paul is doing then. And this explains three things. Paul's Gentiles, when he used the term Gentiles, are the nations, he's going straight to the synagogue on the Sabbath to poach, that's my word, to poach the God worshippers. And that explains to me why some of his Jewish colleagues are furious with him and attack him physically. Just try it. If you're a Roman Catholic, go down to the local synagogue in the middle of the service and try and announce something and see how it goes, and vice versa all over the place, from a Methodist to a Presbyterian church on Sunday. Just try it and see what happens. That also explains to me why when I read Galatians, I try and think, these are pagans reading this stuff? Oh, well, yes, Paul gave them some oral instructions. Are you serious? We can't even figure out what Galatians is saying ourselves with all our study half the time. And after a couple of years, pagans are able to understand all this stuff about Abraham and everything? No, but a God worshiper would know this stuff and might know it better even than a born Jew who takes it all for granted. I had to study the Constitution to become a citizen. I knew it pretty well by the time I was finished, maybe better than if I'd been a born American who had just taken it for granted. Anyway, and the third thing, how could Paul say, after 30 years, I'm finished in the East, I'm going to the West? You say, are you serious? All you hit was about a half dozen big... I see, Paul. You went to the capital cities. That was your strategy. And in the capital city, you hit the synagogues. And in the synagogues, you went for the God worshippers. And then they would take it out. Okay. So then you can move on to Tarragona or where else now. This makes sense of Paul. Why the Jews opposed him, and not all the God worshippers would accept him. Why God worshippers could understand him, and why he's moving so fast. As I said, he doesn't have to lay tracks, so his express is thundering across the Anatolian plateau.
Yeah, and there were two bits in that, where one, right, like the God-fearers are more likely to have an awareness of the broad Jewish tradition. So the concept of a Messiah, the nature and function of the law, they are able to hear and respond quickly. So there's one sense that they're the most ready audience, that not only would they understand it, but it would make sense to them because of their attraction to the God of Israel. that God would act in a revolutionary way to make space in the body, in the people of God for them. Like there's that element, and it also, I think, says something, or maybe do you think it says something about Paul's own mission, that what's ultimately compelling about the life of the church is what happens for the larger community, not the individual articulating it. So
Yeah.
by going and articulating it, and you get this group that forms. It's then their own life in the community embodying it that makes it compelling to people that don't know the story of Abraham and Sarah and such yet.
Yeah, Paul would probably have said, I'm interested in the nations. And that's, on one hand, you want to say, well, aren't the Jews kind of like a nation too? So aren't they kind of under the umbrella? When do we decide that the ethne excludes them? Well, maybe it does practically. But Paul might say, well, have they read the prophets? Paul insists, as he concludes Romans, that everything I'm saying is kind of in the prophets. It's not like I come up with a brand new idea. I'm taking the message to the nations. The Jews have it.
Yeah.
That's why it's surprising. He mentions it comes through the prophets as he concludes Romans. So he would say, especially the nations need to hear it. And that's my mission. So there's a logic, in a way, an intrinsic logic from the revelation of the message. It has to be brought by somebody. Who's going to tell them that the revelation, if you think of the revelation in Romans, that they have crucified the Lord of glory. And they don't even know it. They must know it for their own good, of course.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Cheryl asks, was one of two people asked a question about the Damascus conversion kind of story. In Acts 9:7, there were those with Saul on the road who heard the voice but saw nothing. Why do we never hear anything of these men? And someone else had brought up that story not even matching the multiple tellings in Luke Acts, like the hearing and seeing, or cohering with Paul's own kind of experience of the risen Christ in his letters.
Yeah, look, we Cheryl, we really have to decide. I have no problem with the theatrics of it happening on a road. In fact, it's great theatrics. You're changing from one state of mind to another, and you do it when you're on the road from one city to another. It's a magnificent localization of it. And that's poetic license. I would not say, well, he really didn't do that. But the story is he's persecuting in Jerusalem, Paul. He's doing so successful that he's sent to do some rendition from Damascus. And Paul himself insists, under oath, I was not known to Jerusalem. Now, if he's persecuting Jerusalem, the Messianic Christians, yeah, they know who he is. I do not think Paul started his life in Jerusalem. He started his life in Tarsus and Damascus. All right, so in other words, plain language, as plain as I can make it, the magnificent scenario of the road to Damascus, which is now proverbial, on the road to Damascus, is pure, unadulterated fiction because it's a hatchet job on Paul's apostolicity. That's what's wrong with it. It's not the localization so much. Paul is struck to the ground. He's blinded. You can't see the Lord when you're blinded. He doesn't, as I said, even recognize the Lord. He says, who are you? Who are you? This wipes him out as an apostle, serenely, beautifully, magnificently. But it's a pure fiction. And it's bad fiction because the Jewish high priest had no authority to send somebody, no authority outside even maybe the temple in Jerusalem, if you cross the line in there, maybe. Certainly not to send somebody to Damascus and bring somebody back. The Romans had some idea about local rendition in those days. No, it's not just that it's bad history. It's tendentious history to take away Paul's dignity, authority, integrity. And it has worked fine for 2,000 years.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to try to be quick here.
Sorry.
Well, we just got a lot of really good questions. So, why do you think Luke completely omits the collection for Jerusalem when it was so central to Paul's own mission as described in his letters?
And remember that my argument is you can see him eliminated. It's not that he doesn't know about it. You can actually see it. It has to be there to make sense of the story. But if you admit the collection, then you admit the split. Because from Paul's point of view, the function of the collection is a desperate attempt to heal the split between the Jewish mission, let's call it, and the Gentile mission, to keep it simple now. If you don't have the split, the collection, it's just nice.
Yeah. Well, Andrea asked, what evidence suggests that the traditional account of Paul dying as a privileged Roman citizen is legendary rather than historical?
And by the way, if you want to make him a Roman citizen, I won't waste much time arguing. But Paul himself never says it. He says he was beaten by rods, which is a Roman punishment not allowed to citizens. And besides, there is that time when he goes into prison. Where is it? At Philippi, I think, or wherever it is. He's going into prison, and instead of saying, I'm a Roman citizen, don't you dare touch me, he goes into prison, goes the whole thing, escapes from prison, then makes him apologize. Because if he says he's a Roman citizen, the whole story aborts. So Luke's making it up there. Before you ever get to Jerusalem, the first mention of Paul as a Roman citizen, before he ever gets to Jerusalem, is extremely tendentious and makes no sense. If I'm a Roman citizen, don't touch me. Don't wait till I escape from prison miraculously and then ask for an apology. So it's not worth having a huge argument about, but I don't believe it.
Yeah. Scott asked a question here. Did Paul intend the neither Jew nor Gentile to create a new Christian, non-Christian distinction or to reconcile all seemingly opposed categories?
I don't think it's the categories he's after, it's the hierarchies. As I understand that trilogy of neither male nor female, Jew nor Gentile, male, it's the hierarchy he's after. Because, yeah, there's still, whether he likes it or not, male or female, however you judge it, there tends to be certain anatomical differences. It's the hierarchy he's after. But, of course, you can't take away the hierarchy of master, mistress, and servant without destroying the whole phenomenon. So it's the hierarchy he's after, as I see it, not the category.
Yeah. Danny sent a long question, but it was in reference to some of your work in Search of Paul and in Paul the Pharisee in the lecture about, can you help us understand what the appeal of Jewish monotheism was to the ancient Greeks, the ones that became the God-fearers and were, the first stop on Paul's kind of missionary endeavor?
Yeah. Years ago, I read the book. I'm trying to remember. It's a big, thick book. I'm trying to remember the title. Something like Judaism Among Greeks and Romans. And it gives everything we know about anyone who ever said anything about Judaism. It's a fabulous read. It's a big, long read. But by the time I was finished that book, I was ripe to say, oh, wait a minute. I thought all of the Greco-Roman world looked down on Jews and thought they were kind of some kind of weirdos. The number of sympathetic descriptions of Judaism in Greek and Roman authors, when you accumulate them all together and read straight through, you understand, hey, if we didn't know about God worshippers, or by whatever name, God worshippers, God, whatever you want to call them, these sort of in-betweens, we'd have to project them. Because surely all of this writing is not there if everyone agrees these people are nobodies at the back of beyond. Something else is going on here when so much attention is being paid to them.
Yeah. All right. AJ asks, I like the idea of Luke Acts as an apologetic to Rome. However, how does it work with the decidedly economic focus in Luke Acts, and especially its emphasis on the poor over the rich and powerful?
Okay, two parts. The economics comes up again in my book, Render to Caesar, because again, we mentioned that's really what the book of Revelation is really after. Remember, I mentioned he never mentioned the legions. He does mention the merchants. So it's the economic lure of what I called Mediterranean globalization. Hear the term. Roman imperialism was not just grabbing territory. Rome came up in fluent Latin with, it's the economy, dummy. Mediterranean globalization is what it's about. Now, if I get into that simply as a merchant, will I end up trapped totally inside Roman imperialism? That's what haunts the book of Revelation. So it is about economics. But here's the huge question, and it's going to bedevil, and that's my term deliberately, Christianity for 2,000 years. What's the difference between charity and justice? What's the difference between a fair distribution to begin with and remedial semi-distribution after? Now, when you read through the prophets and the Psalms and the Torah, it's talking about justice. It's the distributive justice of God, starting from Genesis 1. Almsgiving, of course. Almsgiving is remedial. But I think somewhere, I've forgotten where, the book of Deuteronomy, it says, in any case, there shouldn't be any need for alms. Well, yeah, except in disasters, maybe. So the big question is, Luke is all in favor of almsgiving. That's the ideal for these God worshippers from outside. They build your synagogue for you. They support you. That's charity. And charity cannot be a remedy for justice. It'll never catch up.
Yeah. John asks a similar question about Luke's Romanization. How does Romanization of the gospel align with viewing Luke as a champion for the marginalized? Is Luke actually pro-empire? And when you think of, say, Luke as the way it's preached in a lot of kind of mainline Protestant and more progressive Catholic context, is he's the evangelist that or is most often looked to when articulating Catholic social teachings or kind of the National Council of Churches work on social justice and such.
Okay, and yes, especially you can quote some of those hymns at the very beginning in the first chapters. I think Luke has a lot of material, by the way. Luke's problem isn't lack of information. It's interpretation that we're discussing. So I think Luke knows a lot of stuff that may come out of the early Jerusalem church around James, because I think James is conducting a sort of a little mini Qumran inside Jerusalem. I think he is a share community. Not talking about celibacy, but a share community. And I think these are hymns that comes from that community. And Luke uses them. It kind of tucks them up at the beginning, but you don't get it afterwards. I go back again. Is it about almsgiving? And by the way, in Judaism, almsgiving is the one thing that can get you forgiveness of sins. Almsgiving especially gets you forgiveness of sins. Maybe then what almsgiving is sort of remedial. Maybe you're not just being charitable. Maybe this is restitution. If you end up being the richest person in the world, maybe something had to happen along the way which needs restitution. That's the question I see in the Old Testament. This is not even getting to Paul. So again, we're asking, what's the difference between almsgiving and justice? Justice, and by justice, I mean distributive justice. The vision you have in Genesis 1, where God, first of all, distributes existence to everything else, then puts us in charge to lead it according to the Sabbath day, the Sabbath year, the Sabbath Jubilee. It's distributive justice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are a few more questions. We'll see how many we can get to. Just if I go off, we just started having a giant thunderstorm. So I know you're very familiar with those in Florida, Dom.
Yeah, we've been lucky. I mean, when we've been talking, we've never had one.
I know. So Arnold here, who in the long version said, I've read lots of N.T. Wright, so this is where the question comes from. It said your anthropological historical approach is valuable. How does it address Paul's own theological understanding of his mission as fulfilling Israel's covenant vocation to the nations?
No, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. Tom Wright can't do that. First of all, my doctorate is in theology. Let's begin there. In the Bible, so I think like a theologian. When I'm dealing with Paul, I'm respecting Paul as a theologian. If I disagree with him, I will say it, but I don't say, well, he's just a historical figure, an anthropological, a social. No, Paul is making, and Jesus before him, by the way, the historical Jesus makes theological claims on existence, which means on me too. I am perfectly free to say I think he's rubbish. Ditto for Paul, and I would say it. But I'm hearing a theological claim from Paul from the 1st century to the 21st century, and I'm saying, from my point of view, it's still valid. That's a judgment on it. That's a judgment as a Christian. As a historian, I could still tell you, here's everything I see about Paul, and he's a jerk. Of course, but I should still tell you what he's saying. I know what he's saying as a historian. I accept what he's saying as a Christian. Now, anthropological, anything else, but nobody's going to get away by saying, well, I'm not really into theology. Only somebody who hasn't read me can say that.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the other questions here, Tom asked, how did the ideas in Paul's authentic letters get heard or learned by the author of Luke Acts? Like what was his, what do we know about his relationship when composing the gospel correctly? What was his relationship to the letters of Paul at that time?
Okay. I think that the author of Luke has excellent information. I mean, you can even see it in that story of over the wall in Damascus. He knows that story, and he knows a good story when he hears it. But, you read it in Paul, the Nabateans are waiting to arrest. You read it in Luke, the Jews are waiting to kill. Okay, that's typical. That's exactly what you'd expect. He's good information, I'm going to put it this way, and bad interpretation. I shouldn't say bad interpretation. He's interpreting it for the usefulness of the 2nd century, which is as a massive counter narrative to the Roman narrative, not counter philosophy. The rest of the 2nd century will have great philosophers arguing against or defending Christianity. His strategy is, I'm going to have a story because the story rules. If I get the story in, it'll hold. And he's right. He's absolutely right. Nobody is a better storyteller in the New Testament than Luke Acts, except Jesus. And Jesus tells parables, but parables are fictions. So basically, is Luke Acts. It's fictional history. I don't think it's historical fiction. There's too much in there that simply didn't happen and couldn't have happened.
In the chat, we got this question from David. Is there a gospel account of Christ's ministry that's more radically Pauline than what we find in Luke Acts, or, in your opinion, are all four part of this broader attempt to sanitize Paul's message?
Well, Mark, the very first gospel, Mark, who brings together sort of the sayings of Jesus as you find them in the gospel according to Q, and the execution and resurrection as you find in Paul. I'm not saying he's reading them, but I think he's coming with those two streams of tradition. He is really, really critical of the leadership. I mean, what Mark has to say about Peter, James, and John, about the 12, and about good old Judas as one of the 12. He always says one of the 12, as if we didn't know it. That's pretty critical. That's as critical as anything you find in Paul. So that's why it's important that we're reading Luke and we have a source, Mark. That's what really convinces me. I got the source, Mark. I can see Luke changing, the big changes. I'm not talking grammatical changes. And I ask myself, why is he doing that? Why does Luke send Jesus down the left bank of the Jordan when Mark sends him down the right bank of the Jordan, which makes more sense. What's important about Samaria? So I can ask these questions. Now, similar with the second volume, I have in general the authentic letters of Paul. I can't literally see Luke changing them, but times I can. I just mentioned you the exit strategy from Damascus. I can actually watch Luke change, not necessarily Second Corinthians, I don't know, but he may well, I think he does know about the letters. I mean, his geography is too right in general. I don't mean that he everything he does, 3 journeys and all the rest of it, but he knows the places. He never sends Paul somewhere that's really crazy, like Dublin or Galway or somewhere like that. He always says Paul going sort of where Paul going. So he knows stuff. That's not the problem. It's he has deliberately interpreting it with the logic of his own interpretation. And it's not stupid. Luke knows exactly what he's doing. That's why he can figure out what he's doing. And then, okay, Paul's only a character in the Lucan scenario, and I can see what I need to take. Because let's be very clear. I consider Luke to be basically correct on the mission to Cyprus and Anatolia, run by Barnabas and Paul. I think he knows about the collection, and I think he's right about the we sections. I think there is somebody with Paul in the first century on the last trip who's recording it officially for somebody. He's the one Paul mentions in what, 2 Corinthians, about the person who has been sent to accompany me. Now, you don't dismiss Luke Acts. You read it. Where do I see him acting according to his own criteria? Where do I see something? I don't know why he would make that up. But you have to know first what Luke Acts is up to. Otherwise, you just have a Lucan buffet and you take whatever you like and leave whatever you don't.
Yeah. Stefan asked a question that I was really interested in and hadn't even thought of until he mentioned it. What's the role of Marcion and his Roman school, if any, for our understanding of the historical Paul and Jesus, or even Marcion's role right in that move to Rome? Because Marcion, who is condemned as a heretic and such, but even his own canon, if I remember correct, he has the Gospel of Luke and then Pauline letters, and a judgment of the Hebrew scriptures, God as other. So, but knowing that community became popular in Rome, his question's kind of fun.
Okay, Stefan, let me begin by saying I really don't know as much about Marcion as I should. Most of my time, and I spend almost all my time with primary sources, to be honest with you, I've never really had a chance to really study Marcion. So I don't think I know too much about it, to be very honest with you. I think most of my time has been spent trying to figure out Luke Acts as a overall thing. So I think it's rather obvious, though. Who would I go for in the New Testament if I was pro-Roman? Well, I really would go for Luke Acts. So Marcion, I think, is also Roman.
Yeah. I'm sure someone in the chat will tell us if we're wrong, but I'm pretty sure Marcion cut out the apocalyptic elements in Luke, the more Jewish apocalyptic elements, along with the genealogy and the birth narrative, right? So even that Luke Acts narrative of the move to Rome gets detached at the beginning from those kind of like the grounding in the birth narratives of contrasting Jesus and Caesar, the genealogy of Jewish names, him being, going to the temple at 12, all that kind of stuff's removed from Luke in Marcion's account. So, in a sense, it's kind of even intensifying that Romanization trend.
Okay, and I confess again, I haven't really ever studied Marcion to figure out what I really securely said and what I think we're imagining. Okay.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. 2 more. We can do them quickly here. Dennis asked, are you approaching Paul anthropologically rather than theologically?
Didn't
Well, it was the other one was about, this one was about asking if the question of civilization that you're raising through it is similar to Rene Girard's mimetic theory, scapegoating, where you're looking at what the description of humanity and their struggle as understood by Paul.
Okay, I've read Girard, honestly. I thought he was all wrong about scapegoat, because the scapegoat is never sacrificed. In the Old Testament, you never sacrifice a scapegoat, because you'd be giving God the most obscene gift you could possibly imagine. And that's what happens in sacrifice. You sacrum facere, you make it sacred. The scapegoat is driven out into the desert. How do goats do in the desert? They do fine. In fact, if they don't find a desert, they'll make one as soon as possible. Put one in your garden and see what happens. So I never understood what's the scapegoat. I want to say, look, keep it simple. Jesus was executed. Let's get that first. Then we can build a theology on that. I just didn't see it. I didn't find it helpful. That's just me.
Yeah, there are a couple questions about kind of either preaching or teaching these texts to help people both see what's up in Luke Acts, but also when teaching out of Paul's letters, making sure or helping people not reinsert the Luke Acts narrative into them. Do you have any kind of like suggestions or practices or ways that you have found to do that successfully in a teaching context?
Okay, way back now, I'm trying to think. We're talking about 1961 to 1965. 61 to 65, right. I had just come back from Rome. I was teaching at the seminary, and the council was going on 62 to 65. And the local church, local Roman Catholic church, said, this Bible stuff we're supposed to know about, we haven't a clue. Would you mind coming out on Wednesday night and giving a talk about the Bible? So where am I going to begin? And they wanted the New Testament especially. What I did was I ran out in parallel columns, Acts 9, 22, and 26, the three accounts, and I kind of, lined them up as much as could and handed them out to people and said, could we just talk about these three accounts of the same event in the same text? And Luke knows that when you read 9, you're going to get eventually the 2. You're going to know all this. Why doesn't he either tell the same story or say, as I told you before? And I started with that, and I expanded from that. Now, not into what I think now about Luke Acts, no, but I started from a text. Then, so you're allowed to change. So it's okay to say, first time God speaks to Ananias, second time God speaks to Paul, or Ananias to Paul, and then God speaks and there's no Ananias. Where did Ananias go in chapter 26? So we talked about all of that. These were the liberties you could take with a text you had already told people about. Well, wow, if you could do that, supposing Luke had simply skipped 9 and 22 and just told us 26, there'd be no Ananias in the story. So I used that as a strategy, and I found that very helpful. Take key examples, run them off in parallel columns. It's very easy to do that now, if you have a concordance and digitally on your computer, and ask people what they see. And very often they will see what's going on. They'll be able to figure out, well, this guy thinks that. Now, maybe they won't know if the Jews are guarding the gates to kill him and the Nabateans are guarding the gates to arrest him. They might know, well, we got two accounts. I don't know what to do with it. Fine. That'll lure them into history. Because there's two. They might say, oh, well, the Nabateans had the Jews working for them. Okay. All right. Okay. So we solved that one. Mm-hmm. But start with a very simple example and ask people, tell me what you see.
Mm-hmm. So, as we wrap up, I think it'd be good to say a bit about what's happening in session 3 when you start to look at Paul's relationship to Rome, not Paul as in Luke Acts, but Paul from his own letters.
Okay, let me do a resume for this one, please, first. Here's what I'm saying. At the beginning of the 2nd century, Rome, the Roman elites knew a basic story about who these weirdo Christians are, kind of like Aristotelians follow Aristotle, Christians follow Christ, whatever that guy is. But we know this. He's founded a movement over there in that weird place, Judea. We crucified him because of it. It didn't stop it as it should, and it spread all the way. And we have to explain why it spread. So Josephus says, because loyalty perdures, and Tacitus said, wiping the sneer off his face, disease spreads. Okay, fine. Now, I'm Luke, let me say, am I going to argue philosophically like Justin Martyr does? Cost him his life. No, I'm going to tell a counter narrative. That's what we're dealing with. A counter narrative. And in a counter narrative, an apologetical fiction, how much truth, whole truth, and nothing but the truth is tolerated. And I admit I was much more tolerant of it when I was first studying this. I am no longer tolerant with opinion that has not evidence, because that's bias. An opinion against evidence, that is prejudice. Okay, now turning to the next one. Okay, I want, granted all of that, and granted what we should take from Luke Acts, we're now ready to look at the epistles of Paul, to look at them and try and see especially what's going on. That's what we have to do next, actually. Look at the epistles and see especially, is Paul valid for today? Now, Paul thought he was speaking to the nations. He didn't say now. He said to the nations. Is he still speaking to us, or has he done what he had to do for the 1st century? Thank him very much for doing it. But go on to somebody else who speaks directly to us today. Or is it true, maybe, that what is happening to us today, we're in danger of losing not our democracy, but our soul? Because when religion and politics merge in an autocracy, as it did in the 1st century, of course, that's when you start to lose your soul. Not just your freedom, but your soul, your conscience, and everything else. So we go back to the 1st century just to reassure us that we've been at this for 2,000 years. And we should know how to at least conduct it now.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Dom. This has been a lot of fun. And thank you, everyone that's joined live or watched the lectures in advance and sent questions. We had a lot of good ones that went through the entire lecture, which, as someone that has taught online classes before, and the people were taking out loans to do it, sometimes questions are completely unrelated to your lecture, and you wonder just where it came from. So it's always exciting, I'm sure, for Dom when you get questions on stuff throughout the entirety of your lecture. So this has been a bunch of fun. Next week, we'll be looking at Paul and his epistles. So watch the lecture, respond to any of the class emails, and we will get them all organized and structured for next week. So until then, we will see you later.
And thank you.